and funding of adaptations.
The next item of business is a debate on motion number 5653 in the name of Gavin Brown on capital projects. Can I remind all members that this debate and the subsequent debate are extremely tight for time, and we will keep you very closely to your allocated time limit. I call on Gavin Brown to speak to move the motion. Mr Brown, you've got 10 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Our objective this afternoon is to have a focused debate on the NPD pipeline, a Scottish Government flagship programme that was first announced in November of 2010. It's an important subject to debate, Presiding Officer, and it is one also that is completely devolved. Responsibility for that programme, in terms of its positive results or otherwise, rests in Edinburgh. It rests with the Scottish Government. So it's an appropriate one for us to debate in full this afternoon. The other reason for bringing it forward, Presiding Officer, is that in our view there is some key information about the programme that still is absent. We have sought information now over a period of months through committees, through parliamentary questions, through FMQs on 3 occasions now, through topical questions and budget debates, but there is still some critical information absent that this Government has yet to divulge, and we believe it gives the Scottish Government a chance to explain fully the results of the programme thus far, particularly those results on the ground. And I think it's important for the Government today, when they respond, to acknowledge the results on the ground so far, not to talk incessantly about procurement and business cases and what might happen or what may happen, about what has actually happened on the ground thus far. We want the Government, finally, to explain the real reasons for the delays that we have seen. I'm happy to give way to Mr Reid.
I thank the member for taking an intervention. Notwithstanding your characteristically reasonable tone, would you not like to take the opportunity to apologise to the people of Edinburgh for the excessive PFI charges, which mean that before a penny can be spent on education in this city, we pay £30 million in PFI charges?
Gavin Brown.
That was a fairly predictable intervention from a SNP backbencher. I suppose the only surprising aspect was that it took 1 minute and 56 seconds from Mr Reedy. He was about a minute later than his whip had told him to be in intervening on me. Very disappointing, Presiding Officer. But let's hear about the lessons learned from the Scottish Government. Firstly, so that we can acknowledge what has happened, but also to prevent future slippage of the NPD programme, which is to run over the next 7 or 8 years. I challenge this Scottish Government to use its time to explain what has actually happened, as opposed to reflect the balance of their amendment, which simply piles the blame on Westminster. I repeat again, the NPD pipeline is completely devolved and is the responsibility of this Government here at Holyrood. Happy to give way to
I'm grateful to Mr Brown. I wonder, before he proceeds much further in his analysis, if he will acknowledge that one of the reasons why the Scottish Government has had to embark on an NPD programme has been the 26% reduction in our capital budget by the United Kingdom Government.
Gavin Brown.
Presiding Officer, several things. Long before the economic crash, we had PFI and PPP, and at that time the Scottish Government, the then wanting to be Scottish Government, had a not so clear plan about what they were going to bring in. So there was always something that was going to happen. It has always, for decades now, sat alongside a conventional programme. And Mr Swinney, I hope in return, will acknowledge that his budget is going up next year in cash terms to the tune of £7 million. And it is entirely up to him. If he wishes to intervene again, he may care to stand up. But let me, I'll give way in just a moment. Let me finish the point first. It is entirely in his gift how much of that money he decides to switch to capital. He cannot switch the other way around, but if he is unhappy about the division between revenue and capital, it is entirely in his gift to switch more from revenue to capital. Now let's look at what was actually projected at the time of the spending review 2000. Happy to give.
Cabinet Secretary.
Just for the completeness of the debate, would Mr Brown observe and confirm the fact that the Scottish Government has had its capital budget cut by 26% by the United Kingdom Government?
Gavin Brown.
Officer, it has never been denied from this side of the chamber that over the course of a spending review, the Scottish Government budget has been reduced in real terms. But as we all know, next year it goes up in cash terms. But they're determined, Presiding Officer, to discuss anything except the NPD programme. They want to talk about anything and everything except things for which they have responsibility. So let's look at the facts. At the time of the spending review in 2011, they said they were going to spend between £50 and £150 million in 11-12, £353 million in 12-13, and £686 million in 13-14. What happened on the ground in 11-12 was precisely nothing. What happened on the ground in 12-13, we're told, will be £20 million instead of 353, and the latest projections for the next financial year will be 338 million instead of 686. Presiding Officer, this Parliament in this country deserves an explanation, because initially, when it was clear that they had overpromised and underdelivered, their clear strategy was simply not to mention it. Let's not mention it in the budget or anywhere else. And what they actually said in the budget is that we are accelerating the NPD pipeline. They didn't admit that it was being decelerated. They actually said they were accelerating it. And it is so good, our pipeline is so good, that everyone else around the world wants to copy what we are doing. Now, I've heard of also they say that it was simply a variance. The figures are different because it's a variance. But when you say you're going to get 353 and you deliver 20, that is stretching the definition of the word variance to quite a degree. Once they finally had to confront the issue, we've had numerous excuses about the reason. We had the Aberdeen Western Peripheral Route. It was all the fault of the Aberdeen Western Peripheral Route, at least twice at FMQs from the First Minister. But then when we get the official document from the Government about the forecast profile, it was clear that money wasn't projected to be spent on the Aberdeen Western Peripheral Route until 13-14. So that doesn't explain 11-12 or 12-13, even by a penny. Then it was the fault of the Edinburgh Sick Kids Hospital. That's a big project. That's been delayed for a number of reasons. But when we get the official government paper, money wasn't projected to be spent on that until 2014-15. So that doesn't explain it either. Then we had a partially true excuse. It was all down to the Borders rail link. This project is well over £300 million. That explains the difference. But when we get the official government paperwork, it accounts for nothing in 11-12, and it counts for £39 million out of the £353 million in the current financial year. So none of those excuses explain it at all. So we moved then from the incorrect to the inept from the Scottish Government, because when asked for a list of projects that had been delivered, the First Minister stood up in this chamber and reeled off a list of 20 projects that hadn't been delivered. In most cases, hadn't even been started. We then had from the Deputy First Minister at topical questions, the reason given for the delays was because these are large, complex projects that are being procured by a wide range of procuring authorities. Presiding Officer, they were always large, complex projects. They were always being procured by a wide range of procuring authorities. And we also heard from the Deputy First Minister, they're delayed because time was taken up on the preparation and design stage. That was always going to be the case with any construction project in the history of the world. There is a preparation and also a design stage. So, Presiding Officer, we know now which broad areas were held up. We know that the delays this year, the projects that failed to happen, were none of the excuses previously given, but actually community health to the tune of £84 million, colleges to the tune of £65 million, schools to the tune of £119 million, and roads to the tune of £27 million.
You must bring your remarks to
So
close.
we ask, Presiding Officer, the Government today to publish the list for the year before, to explain why so little has been delivered thus far and little will be delivered next year, and to give us a guarantee that the current projections, the latest projections for this year and next, will be delivered in full. And I close by moving the motion in my name. Thank you.
Let that be an example to everybody. Bang on time. I now call Nicola Sturgeon to speak to and move amendment number 5653.2. Cabinet Secretary, you've got 7 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I certainly welcome this debate, not least because it gives me the opportunity to outline the progress being made by the Scottish Government in our capital programme in general and the NPD programme in particular. I think we can all agree that infrastructure investment is fundamental to delivering sustainable economic growth, which, Presiding Officer, makes it all the more galling that the Tories are slashing our capital budget. Absolutely. And the barefaced cheek of the Tories who are slashing our capital budget coming to this chamber to lecture this government on capital investment will not be lost on anyone in Scotland anywhere. It's because we believe that, if you let me just make a bit of progress, I'll give way in a few moments. It's because we believe that capital investment is so fundamental that we published the revised infrastructure investment plan in December 2011, setting out our priorities for investment and our long-term strategy for development of public infrastructure. That plan sets out why we invest, how we invest and what we will invest in from now until 2030. Earlier this month, we published a report on the progress that has been made since the publication of the original plan just over a year ago, sector by sector. We announced newly updated and more detailed investment pipelines containing 30 major programmes, over 100 individual live projects, which we will continue to update on a regular basis. And that progress report outlined that over 2012, and this is something that Gavin Brown didn't see fit to mention, 9 of the major infrastructure projects included in the plan, with a value of over £600 million, have been completed and are now in use. That's a point that Gavin Brown, if he was at all interested in the reality on the ground, I think would have mentioned in his opening remarks. Yes, and I'll give way to Willie Rennie shortly.
The NPD projects were delivered on the ground in 2012.
Cabinet Secretary.
On to the NPD programme. Does Willie Rennie still want to give way in that case?
I'm intrigued by this UK Government angle. Is she saying that the UK Government forced the Scottish Government to mishandle the NPD programme? Is that what she's saying?
Cabinet Secretary.
The UK Government, of which Willie Rennie's party seems to be a proud member, slashed this Government's capital budget by 26%. And if Willie Rennie can't understand the implications of that, then I suspect he goes back to the drawing board and does a bit more research. In any event, Presiding Officer, despite those savage cuts to our capital budgets by Westminster, we are maximising our capital spending to support infrastructure investment and jobs. Over the 3-year period from this year to 2014-15, we will support investment of more than £10 billion through our capital budget, the NPD pipeline, rail investment through the regulatory asset base, and by switching more than £700 million from resource to capital. £3.1 billion of capital investment in this year, estimated to support 40,000 jobs across the economy, an amount that will rise to £3.4 billion next year. Several projects expected to be completed and become operational in 2013-14, including the Aberdeen Community Health and Care Village, Lasswade and Eastwood High Schools, Glasgow School of Art Estate Development. And yes, we expect significant progress to be made on the NPD programme in 2013-14, with major projects like Dumfries and Galloway Royal Infirmary entering procurement, other projects like Inverness College, City of Glasgow College moving into construction. And taking forward a substantial programme of NPD investment, just to remind the Chamber, £2.5 billion of a programme is part of this Government's approach to mitigating the impact of the cuts to our capital budget. And let me just respond to some of the points made in the Conservative motion. As we have been abundantly clear, yes, there has been a reprofiling of investment compared to the 12-13 forecast. And how do the Tories know that. The Tories know that because of the transparency with which this government has made that information available. So the high-level estimate of the profile of capital investment was provided to the Finance Committee in January 2011. Similar profile, including the graph, within the draft budget in 2012-13, based on early estimates prepared by the Scottish Futures Trust. And there are a range of reasons for the changes in timing, because, while Gavin Brown might think this is inconvenient, there are 50 complex projects being taken forward by 30 procuring authority. Significant work has been undertaken with these many authorities to develop each project, and the updated profile reflects this more detailed level of scrutiny and planning. And Gavin Brown seemed to suggest in his opening remarks that we should somehow ignore the process of business case planning and procurement processes. Perhaps it's that kind of irresponsibility that has characterised decisions taken by parties in both the opposition benches at Westminster. The fact is, and this is a point made in Infrastructure UK's cost review in 2010, time taken now to prepare projects thoroughly will deliver better value for money overall. Fuller consideration of opportunities for joined-up asset planning, better building efficiency that leads to cost savings, clearly specified projects allow faster procurement than has been the case previously, appropriate blending of funding to de-risk projects to make them more deliverable. So, as I have indicated, and I am happy to do so again today, progress as a result of that careful preparatory work done is speeding up significantly. And here's another fact the Tories don't like to hear. The estimated total value of NPD projects which have already entered procurement or have entered development through Hub is around £1.6 billion. £1.6 billion. The first health project is already in construction. It will be completed in 2013. Inverness, Glasgow, Kilmarnock colleges, along with the MA, M73, M74 motorway improvements, a range of smaller community health and schools projects will move into construction over the course of this year. That's the reality, Presiding Officer. This government is making significant progress despite the cuts by the Tories, cuts that were first planned by the last Labour government. And of course it is the case that with the full powers of independence and borrowing powers, we can do even more. I move the amendment in my name.
Many thanks. Now call on Richard Baker to speak to and move Amendment 5653.1. Mr Baker, 5 minutes, please.
This is a very important debate Mr Brown has brought forward to the Chamber today, because we've been told repeatedly by ministers of how crucial their NPD programme is to their economic strategy for creating jobs and stimulating growth. And we've agreed with the Scottish Government that the cut to capital budgets has been too steep and too fast and threatened their economic prospects. Ministers have been quite wrong in their description of the previous UK Labour Government's spending plans in terms of infrastructure, and when we did indeed plan to spend more. Indeed, yes.
I'm grateful to Mr Baker for giving way. The previous United Kingdom Government's final budget in March 2010 forecast that public sector net investment would fall in cash terms from £40 billion in 2010-11 to £23 billion by 14-15. The current United Kingdom Government's plans would see that fall from £38 billion to £26 billion. So which part of slash and burn did Mr Baker not associate himself with?
Richard Baker.
Mr Swinney is making a similar claim to George Osborne. Channel 4 Fact Check said that latest figures from ONS show that Mr Osborne's claim to have spent more on infrastructure than what Labour planned is wrong. The coalition has spent £4.7 billion less than what Labour had said they intended to spend. But what we can agree with the Conservatives is that not only is Mr Swinney completely wrong in terms of facts of this debate, but he's completely wrong in the ramshackle description of their MPD efforts in terms of what they are failing to deliver on what they call an important programme. And if every £100 million of investment in this pipeline is worth 1,400 jobs, how many job opportunities of the past year have been lost because of the delays to these projects at the very time when these jobs are needed most? And, President Officer, we were told that this new scheme, NDP, would be transformational from the old PFI, PPP schemes. Well, in some ways it has been, because at least under the old scheme, projects were being delivered. It may have been a slip of the tongue in the budget last week from Murdo Fraser, but he got it right when he called this the NDP programme, the non-delivery profit programme, because the reality is, well, their projects are being delayed, investors are still making a profit. Indeed, in 2012, the public-private awards, in the 2012 public-private awards, the Scottish Futures Trust won an award as the best PP promoter. I haven't seen the shortlist for this year's awards, Presiding Officer, but on the evidence of this debate, I imagine that achievement will not be repeated. But let us be clear. The culpabilities with ministers who have promised these shovel-ready projects again and again, but created the policy context which has ensured there has been a lack of focus on their delivery. The key issue now is that ministers act to ensure that there are no further delays to these crucial projects. I'm sure that throughout this debate, members across the chamber will talk about projects in their own area, and North East members have received an excellent briefing from Aberdeen and Grampian Chambers of Commerce on the acute need for progress to be made on the AWPR, with legal challenge now over, and other projects, including the Hadigan roundabout, which ministers have dithering over for far too long. It's also vital that ministers can demonstrate that they can deliver through MPD the necessary funds for these projects, particularly in light of the experience of Borders Rail, where a funding partner could not be found for the NDP proposal. Our amendment also points to the specific issue of the lack of progress in the schools programme, where last year £119 million was meant to be spent, but the final spending tally was zero. We want to know what dialogue there has been with local authorities on the impact this has had on local educational goals. I take an intervention.
Does Richard Baker not know that the Schools for the Future programme is governed by a national programme board, which includes representatives from local government, that it meets quarterly and progress with the programme is discussed at that forum? Didn't he know that when he submitted his amendment?
Richard Baker.
Therefore, tell us what the result of dialogue has been and the impact of local educational goals on the complete failure of the Scottish Government to deliver its programme spending on schools that was meant to be there through NDP. And in terms of transparency, which Mr Swinney laughingly talked about in terms of this government earlier on, we've tabled so many questions, asked for so many details of the reasons for these delays to each project, and every single time they have been blanked. The idea they've been transparent on this issue is simply laughable, and we need to understand why there's been this systemic failure in the delivery of these projects and what specific issues there have been, so we can better understand how they'll be resolved. It's because we agree it's a crucial programme and important to boosting our economy that we need ministers to ensure these mistakes are not repeated. I hope they can reassure us on these concerns, but at this point in time, our concerns very much remain. We are not persuaded ministers are taking the necessary action to ensure these projects move forward as they should. We will not support the Scottish Government's amendment, but we will support the motion today, and I move the amendment in my name.
Many thanks. Now calling John Mason to be followed by Margaret McCulloch. 4-minute speeches, please. We're very tight for time, so up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think most of us would agree that capital spending is an extremely good thing, and particularly, for example, spending on housing has many benefits beyond the actual building, with jobs, better quality homes, less fuel poverty, better health, better education opportunities. However, the reality is we still have to work within certain constraints, and not least of these is the lack of funds available because of mistakes made down south. We do not have the borrowing powers, but even if we did, we have to require value for money. We still have to pay back the money that we borrow. And I think we have to be clear that the NPD model is different from the traditional funding model and does cause extra complications. In the traditional model, funds can be moved around, and if one project is going a bit slower, money can be moved to one which can go a bit quicker. And we've had examples of that in recent years. Money that was made available for the Sleeper programme was moved temporarily into Scottish Water and switched back later. We do not have that flexibility with NPD. So if one project is being held up and cannot move forward as quickly as we would like, it does mean it's slowed down and the funding cannot be switched elsewhere. But I think we have to remember that we want value for money in all of this. And there is a temptation for some to say, well, we just want to spend money even if it's not producing what we need. But one good example of this, I think, has been the Edinburgh-Glasgow Improvement Project on the rail system, where the plan was to increase the number of coaches, which we currently have, from 4 trains with 6 coaches, i.e. 24 an hour. We have to increase the capacity, and the suggestion was we take that up to 6 trains of 6 coaches, costing £1,000 million. However, the Jacobs report then showed us that for £650 million we could increase that to 32 coaches an hour, i.e. 4 trains with 8 coaches each. Now, I understand that is still being explored, but that is an example of how we should use money better, and spending £1,000 million is not always better than spending £650 million if we are spending that wisely. Because we must remember that all the different funding methods have to be paid for at the end of the day. That is why PFI and PPP and similar models appeared so attractive, because the borrowing did not appear on the balance sheet, and yet it was still borrowing. It was very expensive borrowing, and it has had to be paid back eventually, and as has already been mentioned, that is one reason we are suffering now, because we have to pay so much on PFI repayments. One of the areas we've been looking at too in the Finance Committee is preventative spending, and I think all the parties here are actually signed up to that idea. But we must remember then that we are looking at outcomes, what we are getting out of the system, not just the amount of money we're putting in or the amount of effort we're putting in, but what we are getting out. At a local level, can I just say how positive I am about this government's investment in the East End of Glasgow, which I think everybody agrees is one of the needier parts of Scotland. In particular, projects around the Commonwealth Games, some of which are already completed, like the Emirates Arena, others being built, Tollcross Pool, Hockey Centre and the Games Village, which of course will turn out to be social rented housing after the Games. And one of the most recent announcements, which I very much welcome, the £16 million through Clyde Gateway for a further office development on the Clyde, which will have the benefit of bringing in more investment into the area. I think in the past we've seen a lot of superficial improvements in Glasgow, but what we want now is real improvements. Delighted to say that the George Square plans have been dropped, and hopefully something will happen, but something better. So in summary, Westminster should have spent more to counteract this recession. I welcome the fact the Scottish Government is spending on capital expenditure, whether traditional funding or NPD, and I do urge the Government to stick to its guns and ensure the money is spent properly and wisely.
Many thanks. Now call on Margaret McCulloch to be followed by Richard Lyle. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. For the avoidance of doubt, let me begin today by making it clear that I will be voting for the Labour amendment. Often when we debate capital spending in the Chamber, we find ourselves discussing the mismatch between what the Government would like to spend its money on with what it can realistically budget for. But that's not all we're discussing today. The Scottish budget is under severe pressure, both resource, style and capital. The austerity measures imposed by the UK Treasury are excessive, and they are sucking life out of the Scottish and UK economies. Most parties in the Chamber, though not all, believe that the Chancellor has got it wrong and that it's time for another fiscal stimulus, and a renewed push for growth is long overdue. There was a welcome boost for capital projects following the autumn statement, but public spending on capital remains diminished. Therefore, if the Scottish Government wants to meet their ambitions for infrastructure, then they will have to look beyond public budgets. Frankly, the Scottish Government finds itself in the same position as previous administrations in Holyrood and at Westminster, or even the same position as so many of our local authorities during the Thatcher era. It has to leverage private sector investment into public works if it is to have the slightest chance of realising its ambitions. That is precisely why NPD, just like all the other public-private partnerships we have known over the years, is so critical. Presiding Officer, if I can communicate anything to the Chamber today, then I want to stress the urgency of the need for capital investment and job creation in the economy, as well as the ongoing importance of the NPD pipeline. Be in no doubt business will have been watching the infrastructure investment plan, they will have been watching the NPD pipeline, and some of them will have been watching the Minister's remarks today. I'm afraid that I don't think what we have heard in the Chamber will have reassured the business community or construction firms that Scottish ministers understand the urgency of calls for investment, or that they are developing the shovel-ready pipeline we have been promised. And I don't think they will have heard a single convincing reason as to why the NPD pipeline has delivered so very little when we were all promised so much. I started by saying that today's debate is about more than the mismatch between what the Government wants to do and what it can do within its budget. It's about the mismatch between what the Scottish Government can budget for and what has actually been spent and been delivered. As said before, we were promised that £353 million was to be invested in NPD projects for 2012-13, but the figure turned out to be £20 million. We were also told that £686 million was to be invested in NPD projects for 2013-14, but the budget confirmed recently that plans have been scaled back to £338 million. When they asked for an explanation for that reduction in capital spending, the Finance Committee was told that it was taking longer than originally anticipated to develop the projects and proceed to procurement. And that leads me to my next point. When will the Procurement Reform Bill become the Procurement Reform Act? The Scottish economy doesn't have a great deal to gain from taking projects out of development hell than just to pass them into a protracted and cumbersome public procurement framework. I would remind the Chamber of the comments made by Michael Levack from the Scottish Building Federation in evidence to the Finance Committee. He says that too many capital projects were stuck in a constipated public procurement system. If the procurement bill is to make a substantial difference to Scottish businesses, then it should come back to Parliament without further delay, so we can legislate now to unclog the system.
Please. Thank you very much. That's perfect. Thank you. Now Colin Richard Lyle to be followed by Willie Rennie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would suggest the Tory motion is a tale of two parties. Not the SNP against the Scottish Conservatives, but the Scottish Conservatives against the UK Conservatives. Two different views re capital projects in Scotland and in England. In Scotland, the Tories complain that we are not spending enough, or have failed to spend money set aside. Firstly, everyone but the Tories know that procurement can take time. Placing a contract, or indeed setting up a contract, takes time. Various contracts do have slippage or are delayed due to legal challenges. In a previous life, I know how long contracts take to come to fruition. When money is set aside for a particular purpose, you can't spend it twice, but Tory and Labour members think you can. They often suggest that we do that. If money is moved to another project, I'm sure opposition parties would have demanded to know why that money had been spent elsewhere. You can't have your cake and eat it too. In Scotland, the SNP have made sure that capital investment programme is on course to spend £3.1 billion, supporting more than 40,000 jobs across Scotland. They have consistently called for increased capital investment from Westminster, following unprecedented cuts to our capital budget. Through the Cabinet Secretary, we have moved £700 million switched from resources to capital budget to support capital investment. Why have the Scottish Tories failed at every turn to support our calls for increased capital investment? Will the Tories now admit that the austerity agenda is not working and that Westminster Coalition cut capital spending too far, too fast, and as we have been saying all the time? London Mayor Mr Boris Johnson called on the Treasury and the Bank of England to end the relentless focus on austerity and boost investment in new homes and infrastructure. Johnson said that it was time to junk the rhetoric of austerity and instead take steps to boost confidence in spending. Lib Dem leader and Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg has also admitted that the Coalition cut capital spending too far, too fast. The Scottish Tories would do well to acknowledge the fact that it was their Westminster Tory colleagues, in partnership with the Lib Dems, that cut Scotland's capital budget. The SNP and the Scottish Government have campaigned solidly for 2 years for these cuts to be reversed. The Scottish Tories claim to see the importance of capital spending, so why do they refuse to support our calls for a boost to the capital budget? Projects have been planned in Scotland: the Lothian Royal Hospital for Sick Kids, the Lothian reprovision of the Royal Edinburgh Hospital, the Borders Railway, the fourth replacement crossing, the Parliament House redevelopment, Wester Hales Health Living Centre, and also in Glasgow, as my colleague just said earlier, in the City of Glasgow colleges, the M8, the M73, the M74 motorway improvements, and especially one that I would welcome in my own region, the M8 Baillieston to Newhouse schemes, which is currently in procurement, and the Edinburgh-Glasgow Improvement Programme, and construction in New South Glasgow hospitals and laboratory facility projects, Glasgow School of Art, modernisation of Glasgow subway. I could go on and on. In England, the Tories have scrapped or suspended projects worth £10.5 billion. Michael Gove, cut building for schools in the future in 6 local authorities and was taken to court, and the judge said the failure was so unfair as to amount to abuse of power. Leaked Treasury documents have revealed that George Osborne has anticipated his tighter spending would lead to 1.3 million jobs lost over the years. Can I finish by saying, and ending, if you're looking for a top gloomy fact to impress your friends, you could do worse than point out that the squeeze in public finances in 2012-13 is due to larger than either of the first 2 years of the UK coalition. I support the amendment.
Thanks so much. Now, Colin Willie-Rennie to be followed by Stuart McMillan. Up to 4 minutes, please.
I once had fears that when I entered this Parliament that the SNP masses on the backbenches here would never ever hold their ministers to account. I think after that contribution, I think my fears can be laid to rest. There is no doubt that Richard Lyle put John Swinney and Nicola Sturgeon right up on the rack. They are now scrutinised. They now fear their backbenchers. They are now doing the job that I feared they would never do. So I commend Richard Lyle for his contribution this afternoon. However, I am feeling a little bit sorry for Nicola Sturgeon these days. I know, never thought that from me. This particular job handed on by Alex Neil, who I don't think I see in the chamber this afternoon. At least John Swinney's had the ability and the nerve to turn up and at least answer for the decisions that he has made. But if there's a bit of advice I would have for Nicola, if the boys offer her a new job in the near future, because there seems to be a bit of a trend on this, but if the boys offer her a new job in the near future, I would think twice before accepting that job. The independence campaign perhaps is another indication of a job that I would rather, I'm sure, she would not have accepted. But they would also, I'm sure, the government would accept that saying in the past, on time and on budget, is something we can be tremendously proud of. I don't think we'll hear that, even from Richard Lyle anymore. Only the SNP could claim success out of failure by saying that we now take pride in simply reprofiling the programme on time. Because this government is an expert on every other government, but never on their own government. I think this is probably an indication, maybe not the first, but certainly an indication, that this government is too focused on their obsession of independence to be focused on the real issues that really matter, and that's about creating jobs and opportunities, not just now. Because all these issues this afternoon are devolved issues, but all we hear from these ministers is about what's happening somewhere else. Let's blame somewhere else. Well, the UK government never forced the Scottish government to make a cock-up of their NPD programme. And John Swinney lectured us in previous debates, no, not just now, in previous debates he lectured us for being ignorant, for not recognising that these programmes are very difficult to deliver. He said anyone who tries to suggest anything different is not confronting the reality of some of the circumstances. Now, I presume he recognised that reality back in 2010, when he boasted about this massive programme, and as Alex Neil previously described it as, these projects will energise our economy and deliver a legacy of infrastructure assets. I presume they knew that at the time. I presume they had confronted reality back in 2010. But now, suddenly, anybody who suggested that they haven't managed the programme properly is not confronting reality. The SNP need to confront reality and admit their mistakes. And to say they have been transparent, I think, is very far from reality. What we are facing here, though, is a promise that they would deliver £353 million. They have delivered £20 million. And as Gavin Brown quite rightly said, they said £100 million would deliver 1,400 jobs. Well, we've got 20 out of 353. So my estimation is the SNP have failed to deliver 4,500 jobs. That's the impact. 4,500 jobs of the SNP's mishandling. I think the SNP should reflect on their own abilities rather than criticising anyone.
Thanks very much. Now, Colin Stuart McMillan to be followed by Alex Johnson. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to speak in this debate this afternoon. This is an important issue, not just for those of us within the Chamber, but also to the Scottish public looking at the wide extent of capital projects, from broadband improvements to NHS buildings, from schools to transport and infrastructure. As well as creating jobs in the economy just now, these projects are also creating a better, stronger infrastructure for Scotland's future, and they will be laying the foundations for long-term success. Turning to today's debate, now I note that the Conservative motion seems to accept the Scottish Government's figure of 1,400 jobs are created from every £100 million in capital investment. Now, if this is the case, then maybe the Scottish Conservatives could actually highlight this to the Chancellor of the Exchequer and encourage the coalition to change their policies to supporting rather than attempting to hamper the economy. Also, maybe in accepting the Scottish Government's figures, Gavin Brown could confirm whether he, like David Mundell MP, believes that Scotland actually was extinguished after the Treaty of Union or not. It seems strange to be discussing the capital expenditure of a country which, in the eyes of the Tories, actually has been extinguished. It has ceased to be a country that is no more. Maybe they actually took their lines from Monty Python. But it's one of these kind of strange situations, certainly once again from the Scottish Conservatives. Yet again, here we are discussing a Conservative motion on Scotland's capital projects, or North Britain's capital projects. This from a party not content with the double cross on their emblem. They are foisting the bedroom tax upon Scotland. Now, where actually will the one-bedroom properties come from before the 1st of April? Where is their capital plan for new public sector house building? And during the recent budget debate, we heard more rhetoric with little reasoning or suggestions of where the money would come from the Labour Party as to how to build the one-bedroom properties before the 1st of April. Today seems to highlight that the Tories are of the same mind. Better together, they say. The updated infrastructure investment plan demonstrates exactly how the Scottish Government has and will invest in capital projects that will benefit the communities across Scotland, despite the 26% cuts to the capital budget to the Scottish Government. In my own region of the west of Scotland, we already have seen various projects that have been delivered. The Renfrew and Barrhead health centres completed, the Paisley rail corridor improvements completed, as well as the launch of the first of two hybrid ferries at Ferguson's and Port Glasgow. These are just a couple of examples, just a few examples of investment already made by this Scottish Government. Infrastructure investment is fundamental to delivering sustainable economic growth, both supporting jobs through the construction phase and then, once in use, enabling businesses to grow. However, in looking at the role of the NPD model, it's important to remind ourselves of where we actually came from, of the disastrous PFI schemes initially developed by the Conservatives and taken to the extreme by Labour. In local government alone, PFI debts have reached the staggering figure of over £13 billion, more than the annual funding allocation to local councils. In Inverclyde, we see schools with a capital value of £80 million costing £312 million, while in neighbouring Renfrewshire, schools with a capital value of £110 million transformed to a debt of £538 million. Even Labour MPs, such as Margaret Hodge, are now realising their mistake, stating, "The irony is that we privatised the buildings but nationalised the debts. It's crazy." Now, I wonder if that sentiment is shared by the Tories' not-so-secret weapon in Scotland, the friends in the Scottish Labour Party, or a Scottish Labour too busy providing the human shield for the Tories and their determination to keep Scotland constrained within its powers. And judging by the intervention from John Swinney earlier on to Richard Baker, that certainly still seems to be the case. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I'm conscious of the time, but certainly with the full powers of independence, with a yes vote in 2014, we can certainly do so much more. We don't have to rely upon the cuts and block grants coming from London, and I certainly hope that in 2014 the people of Scotland vote yes to make the infrastructure programme in Scotland a damn sight better than what it is now. Thank you.
Now call on Alex Johnson to be followed by Lewis MacDonald. 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. As the Cabinet Secretary pointed out in her opening contribution to this debate, earlier this month the Scottish Government published a so-called progress report on a range of infrastructure projects and, along with a wish list of new proposals for the coming decade. Numerous schemes have seen their timescales slip since last year, while others are coming in tens of millions of pounds over budget. In the Government's updated programme pipeline, a range of initiatives were unveiled, but with no indication when they will be delivered or how they will ever be paid for. If we look at some of the things that are in there, the Aberdeen Western Peripheral Route, which had previously been estimated to cost as little as £295 million, is now estimated to cost more than £650 million. The A90 upgrade between Balmeedy and Tipperty, formerly projected to cost between £53 and £63 million, is now forecast to cost £92 million. Improvements to the M8, the M73 and the M74 are now estimated at £415 million, compared with the £280 million estimate of last year. These announcements came after weeks of scrutiny from the Scottish Conservatives into why this government had failed to deliver £480 million worth of NPD construction projects over the past 2 years. Alex Salmond had boasted that he would spend £350 million in the current financial year, but the figure is just £20 million. The previous year, he boasted he would spend £150 million, but the figure was nothing. When challenged in this chamber by Ruth Davidson to list the projects which NPD had achieved, he gave us a list of 20 projects, not one of which had actually been delivered. The government's own figures suggest that this failure to deliver that £480 million worth of construction projects could already have cost Scotland tens of thousands of jobs. This wasn't a progress report, this was a lack of progress report. What we were given is a list of schemes that are running over budget or behind schedule, followed by that new list of projects with no detail on where the money would come from. This nationalist government might think the announcement of these projects will act as a bribe to voters ahead of the separation referendum in 2014, but the Scottish people can see right through that. It's bad enough that the government has failed spectacularly on delivering its NPD schemes, with only £20 million of nearly £500 million promised. Now we see a whole list of other projects running the same way. During the course of this debate, we have heard time and again that, of course, this government has suffered from capital reductions which are being passed on from the south. But we must take the opportunity to compare these capital cuts with the behaviour of this government in its own capital project and its projects and its failure to deliver through NPD. The repeated argument that it takes time to organise these things is wearing extremely thin. With only £20 million spent in the last 2 years, we have come to the point where we can look at this government and have to address their failures. The SNP complain about cuts in capital, but they are failing to deliver at their own level. The NPD projects have not been delivered, and we need an explanation from this government as to why their policy has failed so miserably.
Thank you very much. Now calling Lewis MacDonald to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you very much. Investment in capital projects matters everywhere, and nowhere more so than in Aberdeen and the North East. Aberdeen is the most successful city of its size anywhere in the UK. It is currently the best place in Britain in which to find a job. In the next financial year, Aberdeen City Council will be the first council ever to raise more in business rates than it gets in government grants. So Aberdeen and the North East are best placed to lead the whole country on the road to recovery and growth, but weaknesses in its infrastructure still constrain that economic potential. It is now more than 10 years since Jack McConnell announced the support of the devolved government for the Western Peripheral Route at an Aberdeen and Grampian Chamber of Commerce conference in January 2003. It is very nearly 6 years since the SNP were elected and became responsible for delivering that project. To date, very little has actually been delivered on the ground. Preliminary work has finally got underway in the current financial year, largely because Aberdeen City and Aberdeenshire councils were able to meet their upfront costs. And in spite of the long lead-in to getting started, the AWPR is still largely missing from the Scottish Government's own spending plans for the next financial year too. A business community frustrated by years of delay is understandably anxious to see evidence of actual investment coming forward, especially given that NPD is an unproven funding mechanism for infrastructure projects of this scale. When Aberdeen and Grampian Chamber of Commerce surveyed their members during North East Business Week last year, 87% identified the AWPR as a key infrastructure investment which would drive growth. And that is why the Chamber of Commerce is calling this week for publication of the full business case for the AWPR in the interests of transparency to ensure that the full funding package is in place. I would ask the Scottish Government to agree today to publication of the detailed business case for the AWPR and of a full timetable for delivery of the Balmedy-Tipperty section and the airport section of that project in particular. I also agree with the Chamber of Commerce in calling for urgent progress to be made on delivering improvements to the Hoddigan roundabout, and I would ask for a clear commitment today to a date on which that work will begin. Labour's amendment also rightly highlights the question of community engagement on the delivery of capital projects. On the 20th of December, the Third Don crossing was raised in this chamber, and Nicola Sturgeon agreed with me that council should always take local opinion into account. Such considerations are first and foremost for local communities, she said, balancing the needs of the economy and regeneration with the interests of individual communities. If almost everyone in Aberdeen is for the WPR and for improvements to the Hoddigan, almost everyone in Tillydrone is against a Third Don crossing being built in that community. Of course.
A member may be aware, but doesn't seem to be aware, that there was a legal case against the starting of the AWPR. Can he just tell us what Labour would have done differently to bring that forward?
Well, perhaps I might not have offered that the Scottish Government would pay the legal costs of the objector on one occasion, and perhaps I might have taken a different... And perhaps I might have taken a different approach to the planning inquiry. It's very interesting that Mr Swinney in particular is so extremely sensitive to criticism of the delay in this project, which has happened on their watch. But in spite of the objections of so many people to the building of the Third Don crossing in Tillydrone, a majority of councillors, including members of the SNP, have voted to build it regardless. The Cabinet Secretary's comments on the importance of local opinion were noted at a public meeting in Tillydrone last week, and I agreed to pass on an invitation from the local community for her to come to Aberdeen to hear their views. I hope Nicola Sturgeon will take up that invitation and that she will convey the views of local people to others in her own party. That way she will hear for herself what local people really think about spending priorities, and perhaps conclude that those projects which have public support are the ones that should be delivered without further delay.
Gibson, 4 minutes, please.
I must say, Presiding Officer, I was taken back by the temerity of the Tories to table a debate on capital spending at the same time that their Westminster colleagues are cutting this Parliament's capital budget by 26% in real terms. Yet without a trace of irony, Conservative members have today attacked the Scottish Government's record on infrastructure development and capital projects. It really is quite unbelievable. Considering that the SNP is the only party in this chamber to have recognised the importance of maintaining capital budgets and growing the economy out of recession, and have actually made real efforts to boost capital spending, this Tory hypocrisy and that of the Lib Dem lapdogs is frankly staggering. Of course, while it's easy to point the finger of blame at the Tories, who for ideological reasons seem to enjoy cutting government spending, we must remember that we had the misfortune of an inept Westminster Labour government whose Chancellor promised cuts deeper and tougher than those of Margaret Thatcher. Alistair Darling, now reborn as the public face of the Let's Hold Scotland Back campaign, and his colleagues are clearly complicit in the economic mire the UK is in today. The irony of the Labour-Tory bitter-together partners criticising the Scottish Government on capital spending will not be lost. Gavin Brown questions the success of the NPD model and rejects explanations as to why there has been some delay in delivery. However, at the meeting of the Finance Committee on 16 January, Mr Brown was offered a comprehensive explanation by both Barry White and Peter Reiki of the Scottish Futures Trust, who went into some detail as to how some of the difficulties encountered and how these have been improved in recent months. At that meeting, Mr White explained, and I quote, can I at least quote Mr White first, Mr Brown, before I give active consideration to whether or not I take an intervention? Mr White explained, it has always been understood that NPD financing is different in nature to capital financing and follows the progress of a project. An example is the Aberdeen Western Peripheral Route, of which we've heard much this afternoon, which went through a lengthy legal process. In capital financing, if a project is held up in a legal process, the funding can be switched to and spent on other projects. However, in NPD financing, the money is allocated to a specific project and is not interchangeable in that kind of way. Mr White also explained that often lengthy procurement processes, which are being significantly shortened incidentally to on average just under 18 months, can impact on delivery timetables. Mr White also pointed to the example of having to renegotiate PFI contracts at the Royal Hospital for Sick Children in Edinburgh led to significant delays. Mr Brown, briefly.
Gavin Brown.
Okay, the member says that procurement is significantly shorter. So procurement is significantly shorter than expected. Can he explain why construction on the ground hasn't happened?
White has actually said that the procurement is being significantly shortened. They also, incidentally, also said that, the money to be spent through NPD would be £200 million more in financial year 2014-15 than was originally estimated. So that seems to be something which the Tories have missed out in their deliberations this morning. Of course, if you look at the alternative methods pursued by both the Tory and Labour governments to supplement capital spending, Tory PFI and its rebranded New Labour twin PPP. These failed policies hung a millstone in the form of billions of pounds in debt around the neck of NHS boards, local authorities and future generations of taxpayers. In recent years, North Ayrshire Council, until last year under Labour control, now SNP, I'm pleased to say, built 4 secondary schools with a capital value of £83 million. However, due to the PFI PPP model pursued, taxpayers will fork out £400 million over the next 30 years. This profligacy meant that last year North Ayrshire Council spent £11 million on PFI payments, a figure that will rise year on year to £16.6 million in 2037. It is the equivalent, presiding officer, of buying a modest £83,000 flat and then paying a horrendously expensive rent of £1,111 a month for 30 years. I say rent because the property wouldn't even then be your own after those 30 years were finished. Given their shameful records, it beggars belief that Tories and Labour criticise the NPD model, a model where profits are capped and surplus is directed to the public sector. This government has shown its commitment to boosting capital spending and has been long ahead on the curve in recognising its importance in growing the economy and creating jobs. Thank you.
Many thanks. Now call on Dr Elaine Murray. 4 minutes, please.
This is winding up. Yeah. Right. This has been a useful debate in illuminating the failure of the Scottish Government to deliver on its promises to invest in Scotland's infrastructure through its much-trumpeted Scottish Futures Trust. Now, this SNP government deploys 2 principal arguments. The first, of course, is that everything bad that happens is Westminster's fault. Now, there are many things that I don't like that the current UK government has been doing, and that's one of the reasons I'll be campaigning for a change in government in 2015. But I don't think you can put every terrible disaster at the door of Westminster. Of course, the second argument deployed by this government is that assertion trumps evidence, because if they say something, it must be true, however contrary the evidence. So if they say they have delivered projects, they have, even if those projects are as invisible as the Emperor's new clothes. Let's cut through this stuff about the recession. The SNP manifesto in 2007 declared that they would propose a new system of infrastructure funding as an alternative to PFI PPP, and that they would introduce a not-for-profit Scottish Futures Trust, which would provide lower-cost borrowing opportunities. And eventually, after much prevarication, which resulted in the infrastructure pipeline virtually drying up, the SNP came forward with NPD, which, according to Mark Hellaway of Edinburgh University, has long-term costs that are similar to that of the classic PFI model, and that, I quote, it makes PFI a bit more politically acceptable without changing any of the economics. And as for the other slow-moving delivery vehicle, HubCo, this applies the design, build, finance and manage model used in the majority of PPP projects, where the public sector partner has certainty on costs across the cycle and the private sector partner assumes the risks. So what was so difficult, what was so novel and so difficult about NPD that it was so delayed? And we've heard already that we only had £20 million of community health projects will actually be delivered this financial year, and that the next financial year project delivery is reduced to 40% of what it was before. And it was, in fact, the Scottish Futures Trust who gave us this information, not the Scottish Government, despite, again, its assertion about its transparency. But when Gavin Brown questioned the First Minister on this dismal record of delivery FMQs on the 31st of January, we were again treated to an assertion about he reeled off 13 projects and bundles which he claimed were being delivered. Now, I've checked the SFT's most recent pipeline projections, and the earliest that any of these will be delivered will be 2014, which rather begs the question of the definition of delivery. If I have a parcel delivered, it is when it falls through my letterbox and I pick it up and it comes into my possession, not when the sender goes off to procure a stamp. And the Deputy First Minister mentioned in her speech Dumfries and Galloway Hospital. That hasn't even developed a business case yet, never mind got planning permission. The Deputy First Minister also claimed earlier this month that they were going to deliver 67 schools through the NPD programme. But its pipeline includes a number of school mergers which require consultation under its own Schools Consultation Act of 2010. And that includes the Crichton 15+ school in Dumfries, which is still under consultation. It is actually very controversial and may not ever happen. And yet, Deputy First Minister has asserted that this school will be delivered, despite the fact the Education Secretary has assured me that public opinion on this will be seriously considered. So yet again we see assertion, we see bluster, as usual, but what we want to see is delivery, not a whole load of warm words.
Thank you very much. Now, Colin John Swinney, up to 6 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, we've learnt a very important lesson this afternoon and of the subtle difference between Dr Elaine Murray and Richard Baker. At least Dr Elaine Murray thinks of her own jokes to share with Parliament, rather than Richard Baker, who repeats Murdo Fraser's and Gavin Brown's, to give him full and proper credit for the whole story. I thought that was the most revealing thing this afternoon, that the Bitter Together campaign has now got to the point where there are interchangeable speeches between Richard Baker and Gavin Brown to try to reinforce the same cheery contribution to the debate. So let me try to perhaps shed some light on some of these similarities of the position that's been taken by the Conservative Party and the Labour Party today. And let me return to the issues around about capital expenditure, because this is where the debate really starts in terms of the key issue that has to be resolved. As I set out to Mr Baker in my intervention, the previous United Kingdom Government's final budget in March 2010 forecast that public sector net investment would fall in cash terms from £40 billion in 2010-11 to £23 billion by 2014-15. So there we have the confirmation that the Labour Party planned to apply a very significant reduction in capital DEL expenditure to the Scottish, to the public sector in general, the consequences of which would have been felt by the Scottish Government. Now, the current United Kingdom Government's plans will see public sector net investment fall from £38 billion in 2010-11 to £26 billion in 2014-15. So there we have the similarity of budget approach being taken by the Labour Party and the Conservatives. So the Labour Party are in no position to complain about the Conservatives and the Liberals' approach to capital expenditure, because the Labour Party had the gem of the idea that the right way to tackle the financial difficulties that we face as a country was to lay into capital expenditure budgets, which they, of course, now try to recoil from their past. Now, on the scale and the substance of capital budgets, Mr Brown has made a great deal about the timetable for NPD and the importance of this work being undertaken. Let me just point out to Mr Brown that if the capital budget of the Scottish Government had remained constant at 2010-11 levels, we would have had an additional £2.5 billion of capital expenditure available to us to be deployed in the delivery of particular capital projects. And to turn that into the rhetoric of the motion that Mr Brown has put forward today, that could have supported 35,000 jobs in Scotland, 8,750 each year between 2010-11 and 2014-15. So before Mr Brown lectures anybody about the impact on employment, our starting point must be the decisions of the United Kingdom Government to reduce capital expenditure in the fashion that they have done. I'll give way to Mr Brown.
How many jobs would have been supported if NPD had been delivered according to programme?
Well, the point I was making to Mr Brown is before he passes out any particular lessons to anybody else about capital expenditure, the process of capital challenge we face started and stopped with the actions, first of the Labour Party, carried on by the Conservative Party in government. Now, the Deputy First Minister went through in her contribution the preparatory stages that we have to go through to ensure that projects are well-founded. And why does that matter? Well, that matters because in the process of preparing the schools programme, for example, our initial estimate was that we would get 55 schools for the budget resources that we had available. The current projection, because of ensuring there is careful design work, that we don't duplicate effort between similar projects, we can actually deliver 67 schools for a budget that we originally thought was going to deliver 55, which is exactly the point that my colleague Mr Mason was making in the debate. Now, somehow, the argument in Parliament today is that we shouldn't go through this process. We shouldn't constantly be searching to make the money go further, to have a greater impact, to deliver more improved schools. According to the Conservative Party, we shouldn't be interested in delivering increased value for money for the taxpayer, which is a ludicrous position for even the Conservative Party and Mr Johnson to occupy.
Alan Johnson. Surely the Cabinet Secretary realises that that is not what we are saying, and that what he appears to be justifying is the idea that permanent procrastination will deliver something. It has delivered nothing. It will deliver nothing.
Cabinet Secretary.
Mr Johnson spent most of his speech complaining about the fact that we were spending too much money, so I don't think he's in a particular position to ask us to act in that fashion. Now, we've had a big debate today about transparency, and we've had a debate with lots of numbers floating about, lots of information. Where have this lot got the information from? They've got it from the government, from SFT, from websites. If Mr MacDonald wants to know when the AWPR is scheduled to start and to be delivered, he should check with the Scottish Government's website. That's where all the information is. If he could do his own research rather than having it handed to him on a plate, he might actually be more effective than he has been today.
Thank you very much, Mr Swinney. That's perfect. 8 minutes, Mr Brown.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Well, what a place to finish for Mr Swinney. This Scottish Government is transparent. Most people think transparent means you give information freely, you help people reach your own decisions, but in his view, even though it takes months to get anything at all from them, even though the first excuse turns out to be palpably untrue, even though the second excuse turns out to be untrue, even though the third excuse turns out to be untrue, and months down the line we still don't have the full details, they are transparent, Deputy Presiding Officer. Well, we've had some fantastic contributions from the SNP today, I have to say. In terms of the debate, we had...
Order.
Presiding Officer, the Cabinet Secretary. The Cabinet Secretary really shouldn't generate more excitement than he can comfortably contain. We had Richard Lyle, who has to be congratulated. He managed to go an entire 4-minute speech without even passing by the subject of NPD. A record beaten only by Nicola Sturgeon, who managed 4.5. We had Stuart McMillan, who I have to confess I was slightly lost in his speech, but I was comforted by the fact that he too appeared to be lost during his speech. And then we had the inimitable Kenneth Gibson, who said with a straight face, we had a comprehensive explanation at the Finance Committee as to why these projects were delayed. The comprehensive explanation that he gave us today was the Aberdeen Western Peripheral Route, even though Speaker after Speaker today had gently pointed out that money was never intended to be spent on that project until 2013-14. It is no explanation at all, not even a penny's worth of explanation for the failure in 11-12 and 12-13. With the bizarre statement from him also that procurement under the NPD model is significantly shorter. It's much shorter. Now, that might have sounded good as a soundbite, but it's slightly more tricky to then explain why nothing has happened on the ground if your procurement is significantly shorter because of the new system that you have. And he finished off, of course, by saying that this government is ahead of the curve. It's creating jobs and growing the economy all through the NPD without even realising that nothing has happened in the first 2 years of the project. We had a particularly disappointing contribution, I think, from our ministers today. We asked for some fairly straightforward stuff at the beginning of this debate. We asked them to acknowledge, at least acknowledge once, that the results are a bit disappointing in terms of what has happened on the ground. Not a single minister or government representative has admitted that it's disappointing. We haven't had the real reasons why things have been slowed down. We haven't had anything from the government that lessons have been learned. And we got the usual rant about how it's all Westminster's fault. But as gently, it is. I mean, it's so predictable. Even
have a little bit of courtesy, please.
Deputy Presiding Officer, as was pointed out in an intervention by Willie Rennie, he asked a very simple question. How much of the failure on an NPD can be blamed on Westminster? The answer to that question is nil. The entire NPD programme is devolved. There is nobody else to blame except the Scottish Government for the failure to deliver on the NPD programme. Now, let me turn to the ministers. Let me turn to Nicola Sturgeon's contribution, because, sure.
Keith Brown.
Gavin Brown expresses himself disappointed by the pace of NPD projects. We'd like to see how he feels about the West Coast Mainline project that the UK Government has tried to procure for Scotland.
Gavin Brown.
More desperate stuff from Keith Brown, OK? Ignoring everything that's been said so far. A complete failure to talk about the NPD programme, which the entire debate is about, trying to throw in anything else at all to take away the spotlight being shone on his government. Now, if Nicola Sturgeon said it's not a delay, we haven't delayed things at all. It's simply a matter of reprofiling. The whole project has been reprofiled, which will be a good one to use, I think, in any future debate. We heard about the transparency, and it wasn't a delay of years. It was just that there was some extra time taken in case of the programme as a whole. And once again, we heard nothing but blame thrown at Westminster, despite the fact that the NPD is entirely at the behest of the Scottish Government. We thought we might have, in the closing speech from John Swinney, some explanation, some detail about what has actually happened, but he spent the opening few minutes of his speech just talking about what he thought were similarities between the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, and then he put forward, I wish he would get as interested in the NPD programme as he does talking about other parties, then we may make some progress. And he also put forward the absurd proposition that this party here didn't think preparation was important. It's all down to the preparation stages. But, Deputy Presiding Officer, did he seriously not realise in November 2010, when he put forward the NPD pipeline, when he boasted about the £2.5 billion, at that stage, did he not realise that there would have to be preparation for the construction projects? He'd been in government for 3 years at that point. He is a smart chap, Deputy Presiding Officer. Surely to goodness he was pretty aware that there would need to be some preparation on the NPD projects to avoid duplication and to make sure the projects function. So, Deputy Presiding Officer, we are no further forward today at all on the subject of community health. £84 million was meant to be spent on community health this year, and it is not being spent. We do not know why it is not being spent. £65 million were supposed to be spent on colleges. We have not been given a single reason from anybody in the government as to why not a penny of that investment has happened this year. In relation to school, West Coast Mainline is not in the NPD programme, Mr Brown. As a Transport Minister, I thought you might have been aware of that, but never mind. In relation to schools, £119 million was supposed to be spent this year. Nil is being spent. We've not had a single reason or justification for that. £27 million was supposed to be spent on roads. Not a penny will be spent, and we don't have any reason for that. So we asked for some very straightforward things at the very start, as if the government should publish the high-level list for 2011-12, just for the sake of completeness, so that we can see what wasn't delivered in that programme there. And they should still explain clearly. We still ask them now, after the debate. Perhaps they can do a release, perhaps they can publish a paper. But tell this Parliament why nothing was delivered in 11-12, why we're only getting £20 million in 12-13, and why in 13-14 it's about half of what it was supposed to be. And please, in closing, Deputy Presiding Officer, can this government give us a cast-iron assurance that the latest projections, the much lower latest projections, will be delivered in 12-13. It won't be less than £20 million, and that in 13-14 it won't be lower than they're currently saying. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And that concludes the debate on capital projects, and it's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 5654 in the name of Jackson Carlow on health. Mr Carlow, if you are ready, 10 minutes please, and members, would you like to press your buttons? Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I begin right at the start of this debate by saying that Conservatives have framed the motion today with a view to making a qualitative progress on the subject of cancer this afternoon in the Chamber. And in that spirit, can I say that we will support the Labour amendment? And can I also say right at the start that were the SNP amendment to be supported, we will support the amended motion at the end of business this afternoon. And why? Because no party here has a monopoly of concern on the subject of cancer. Why are we here as politicians? We're here sometimes to embrace and to make progress on behalf of people in Scotland on big issues. Such was the progress that we made on free personal care. And similarly, such must be the progress that this Parliament now makes on the treatment and the delivery of treatment of cancer. And across this chamber, I acknowledge there is a commitment throughout. A quick look at motions that are available for members to support will show a motion from John Pentland on the Little Princess Trust, from Jackie Bailey on International Childhood Cancer Day, from Stuart McMillan on the Ellen MacArthur Cancer Trust Sailing Hub, from Colin Keir on NICO 35 fundraising for various cancer charities, from Kevin Stewart on Clan Cancer Support, from Siobhan McMahon on NHS Lanarkshire Cervical Screening Award, and again from Jackie Bailey on Cervical Cancer Prevention Week. Every side of this chamber has members who are committed to advancing the progress this Parliament can make on the treatment of cancer. And I also make mention of Sandra White's motion before Parliament just now, which the majority of my colleagues have supported, and which I think and hope all members will, on breast cancer early detection. We all have experience of family, of friends, and indeed of colleagues who are facing or who have faced the ordeal of cancer, and who individually, I believe, have inspired us in the way that they face that ordeal and in the way that they go about their lives as they come to terms with their condition. As a teenager, before I was ever interested in politics, making my way through town on the way home from school, outside and underneath the canopy of Marks and Spencer's in Argyle Street, there was a lady, I don't know of what age, she was frail, but she was there in all weathers with a tin, shaking it on behalf of cancer research. And that inspired me as a young person, that here was somebody who at that time, campaigning for funds for a disease which actually many people refused to talk about in public, and for which many of us thought there would never be a cure, was committed in that way. Presiding Officer, Sandra White's motion on breast cancer places the emphasis on early detection. But we live in an age of remedy. We live in an age of relief, if not yet cure. And in 2010, Professor Sir Mike Richards, noting that in respect of cancer drugs that have developed in the last 5 years, we were 12th out of 14 countries in the UK, and in 10 years, 10th out of 14 countries in making available drugs, introduced or led to the introduction in England of the Cancer Drugs Fund. And since then, some 25,000 people in England have benefited from drugs which are available under that fund. Famously, and now also by exception in Scotland, abiraterone for prostate cancer, cetuximab for colorectal and breast and kidney and brain cancer, everolimus for kidney, neck and esophageal cancer, lapatinib for breast cancer, rituximab for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, sorafenib for kidney, bendamustine for non-Hodgkin's, fulvestrant for breast, eribulin for breast, ipilimumab, which I'll say more about later on, for melanoma and skin cancers. These are the top 10 of 23 treatments for cancer available in England, but not yet available in Scotland. And the only political point I'll make this afternoon, which I think may be regarded as partisan, is that the suspicion, sometimes on our side, is that the reason that the Scottish Government did not introduce a fund for cancer drugs was because the initiative initially came from a Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition government elsewhere. And that's unfortunate if that is the impression that has been created, even if it is not the reality or the truth. It is not a choice. I will, in due course, it is not a choice between detection and making available drugs. These are two halves of the approach that this Parliament should be seeking to ensure are made on behalf of people.
Mark MacDonald.
I know Mr Carr was making a fleeting political point, but perhaps I could quote him: Breakthrough Breast Cancer Scotland. Breakthrough would suggest that rather than introducing a cancer drugs fund in Scotland at this stage, when it is likely to have a limited impact before the implementation of value-based pricing in 2014, a thorough review of the effectiveness of current drug access system in Scotland is undertaken, that which is being done at the moment. Melanoma Action Support Scotland. We do not want a cancer drugs fund. Treatment is required for other life-limiting diseases too. Macmillan Cancer Support. We do not support the introduction of the drugs fund in Scotland. It's not just the Scottish Government doing it, Mr Carr.
Many of these quotes and papers that Mr MacDonald refers to were issued at the time of the commencement of the Cancer Drugs Fund in the expectation that something better would follow in Scotland the interim period. But in the interim period, we have not made progress, and in consequence, some 25,000 people in England have had access to treatments for cancer which have not been available in Scotland, and by calculation, some 2,500 people in Scotland have been denied access to life-saving treatments. Now, the consequences of this were made clear to the Health and Sport inquiry by oncologists. They said if the current situation remains with regard to poorer access to new medicines, it will negatively impact on this aspiration due to a drift in oncologists from within Scotland conducting less innovative research. In addition, due to Scotland in many situations no longer treating patients with the standard of care used in other parts of the world, Scotland may not be able to take the lead or even to take part in global research studies. We can't afford to allow Scotland to be marginalised in the future development and treatment of cancer. And I pay tribute to the Health Secretary, because I believe that with the Routledge and Swainson reviews which he has commissioned, and also in consequence of the Health and Sport inquiry, he is to some extent seeking to escape from the electric policy chair, if I can call it that, of previous government policy. We recognise that from next year, potential value pricing will change the emphasis and allow the assessment of the progress of a drug to be calculated rather than and put the boot in the other foot, in a sense to put the emphasis on the pharmaceutical companies to make these drugs available. Presiding Officer, Nanette Milne will talk about Tina McGeever and Mike Gray, but I'd like, by illustration, to talk about Ken McIntosh, who hosted a dinner on behalf of Mascot Melanoma Action Support again in Scotland. At that, we heard from Girish Gupta of NHS Lanarkshire and from Tim Crook, Consultant Medical Oncologist at the University of Dundee. But we also heard from Paula McIntyre, whose husband Scott died last year, but who was, through a clinical trial, given access to ipilimumab. It gave him 6 additional months of life. Now, in her article last week, Joan McAlpine in the Daily Record summarised that as new drugs are often of negligible benefit. They prolong life for just a few weeks or months, and only then in particular patients. No, I'd like to make this point. Now, I'm not someone who gets overly emotional in politics. I've been around long enough. The hard knocks come, and you accept that. My children tell me, though, that I can't get through E.T. or the climax of The King and I without blubbering. But nonetheless, I think it would have taken a hard heart not to recognise that those 6 additional months that were afforded to Scott McIntyre and his family, in which he had a quality of life which allowed his family to prepare for the end which finally came, were not just to be casually dismissed, but were of enormous value to him and his family.
Last minute.
So, what is essential as we move forward from here today is, I think, the government already recognising that, having introduced the Rare Medicines Fund, the principle has been established that it is time to make progress on addressing the deficiency that exists within the current SMC assessment process of affording access to these drugs. I don't care, frankly, whether it's now called a Cancer Drugs Fund in Scotland. It may be called an Innovation Fund. It may be a Chief Scientist's Fund. What is required now, before we get to value pricing, and on the back of the reviews that are taking place, and following the introduction of the Rare Conditions Medicines Fund, is a recognition that cancer is now the one condition that we are not serving the people of Scotland effectively with. We need a fund of sorts which allows the gap to be plugged between the two. One small step for cancer, one giant leap for cancer sufferers.
Thank you. I now call on Alex Neil to speak to and move Amendment 5654.2. Cabinet Secretary, maximum 7 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. And can I say, this is a difficult subject. It's a very sensitive subject, and I think we all recognise that making decisions about which medicines to provide for NHS patients in Scotland, or indeed anywhere else, is very complex and sensitive. And it's particularly so when making decisions about medicines to treat chronic or life-limiting conditions. It's therefore vitally important that such decisions are taken by people who have the necessary knowledge, skills and experience to do so, not politicians but clinicians. There are thousands of Yes, I will, Jim.
Jimmy D.
The Cabinet Secretary for taking an intervention, but does he recognise that public trust and confidence goes to the heart of this debate, and that the public have a right to expect that if their clinician believes that they would benefit from a medicine in the course of their treatment, then that is something that should be made available, and that ultimately will be the test on which the review of the individual patient treatment request process will be judged.
Alex Neil.
Presiding Officer, I'll deal with some of those points in my speech. I'm saying that there are thousands of medicines in various doses and formulations available to clinicians in the UK, and in Scotland there are something like 15,000 medicines which can be prescribed by our doctors for various conditions. The Scottish Medicines Consortium appraises around 60 new medicines each year and publishes advice for NHS boards on their clinical and cost effectiveness. A significant number of these are described as Me Too medicines, which means they are one of the many available to treat a particular condition. The Scottish Medicines Consortium was given the important task of providing national advice for NHS boards in Scotland about which medicines offer the clinical outcomes required by clinicians and represent value for money. In doing so, the SMC recognises that where a new medicine is one of many to treat the condition in question, local clinicians are best placed to decide whether this newly launched medicine should be added to the formulary list of medicines available for routine prescription for their patient population, or whether there is a preference for prescribing those medicines that they have experience in using and for which the safety profile is known and trusted. Where an NHS board chooses not to add a new SMC-accepted medicine to its formulary, clinicians may still seek NHS board agreement to prescribe it for individual patients through a very straightforward non-formulary request. Where the SMC does not recommend a new medicine, NHS boards are not expected to routinely prescribe it. However, NHS clinicians can pursue access to such medicines on a case-by-case basis for individual patients where they believe they can provide a robust clinical case to support it. These are local clinical decisions based on the clinical circumstances of each patient. I have listened to concerns raised by some clinicians and patient groups regarding differences in availability of medicines between Scotland and England,
particularly in relation to cancer medicines, since the Department of Health did launch the Cancer Drugs Fund in England. And whilst I can fully understand these concerns, it is important to note that comparisons between medicines available in England and Scotland are not always valid. Indeed, there are some medicines that have been approved for use in Scotland that have not been approved in England. Lists of medicines do not tell the whole story about available treatment for cancer or improvements in cancer care. Some improvements are due to earlier diagnosis or developments in technologies other than medicines. NICE, the equivalent of SMC down south, looks at a limited list of new medicines, but SMC looks at all new medicines. This means that SMC-approved medicines are available in Scotland. For example, imitinimab, for treatment of certain gastrointestinal tumours, has been accepted for restricted use by the SMC in Scotland, but not recommended by NICE. Another example is mercaptopurine, for treatment of certain leukaemias, which has been accepted by the SMC, but for which there is no NICE advice. This can potentially lead to significant variation in the use of this medicine within the NHS in England, let alone between Scotland and England. Appraisal of new medicines is dynamic, with new and updated advice published every month north and south of the border. Scotland's decision not to introduce a cancer drugs fund reflects our policy position that creating ring-fence funding for a single disease area effectively diverts resources away from other conditions, including severe and other life-limiting conditions. And just for the record, can I just put it on the record that the fact that it was a Tory government that proposed it had nothing to do with our policy decision in Scotland. In providing advice to the Public Petitions Committee in the Scottish Parliament just over a year ago, key cancer charities, this was well after the Drugs Fund had been introduced in England, including Breakthrough Breast Cancer, Macmillan Cancer Support Scotland and Myeloma UK, recognised that a cancer drugs fund was not a necessary policy measure in Scotland. It is a view that is also shared by the Welsh Government. However, I do remain committed to considering any ways in which we can genuinely improve access to clinically and cost-effective medicines which may improve outcomes for patients in Scotland.
Last minute.
That is why I have asked Professors Routledge and Scott to oversee a review of how new medicines are introduced in the NHS in Scotland, from national appraisal by the Scottish Medicines Consortium through to local NHS board decision-making, including individual patient treatment requests, about which I recognise there are concerns about how that process is working, and they are concerns this review, and I've no doubt the committee review, will want to address. The final point I want to make is this. If you create a cancer fund and put a substantial amount of money into it, then that money has to come from elsewhere in the health budget. And I do think those who are proposing a separate cancer fund do have to tell us where the money will come from and how much money they want to put into that fund, so that we know what the policy choices are. It's a difficult decision, and it's one that is increasingly going to have to be faced up to by politicians, but I do hope that we can at least recognise right across the chamber that this is a subject on which we can express our different points of view, but do so in a tone that's appropriate in terms of the patients who are looking on in this debate.
Thank you very much. I now call on Jackie Baillie to speak to and move amendment. Sorry, Cabinet Secretary, did you move your amendment? Cabinet Secretary, did you move your amendment?
Sorry, I moved my amendment, Presiding Officer.
And I now call on Jackie Baillie to speak to and move amendment 5654.1, maximum 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to debate access to new medicines in the NHS and the tone of both Jackson Carlo's contribution and indeed the Cabinet Secretary's. And I recognise that the Cabinet Secretary has indeed initiated a new medicines review, and that too is welcome. It is right to consider how the Scottish Medicine Consortium operates, and while it is the case that their work is highly regarded, there are some constraints caused by the criteria set for them by the Government. Equally, it is right that we should review individual patient treatment requests. If clinicians and patients are telling us quite clearly that these are an obstacle to getting medicines that they need, and that there is a variation in approach across Scotland, then we must consider this. Labour, like the SNP, didn't support the Cancer Drug Fund, not because it was proposed by the Tories, but in part because we did genuinely believe that there were other equally serious conditions that required improved access to medicine too, and because emphasis was placed on early treatment, because that preventative approach led to better outcomes. But I also recognise, though, that in practice the Cancer Drug Fund, as it's been operating in England, has led in some places to a bit of a postcode lottery, which isn't, I believe, desirable. But having said that, I think continuing with the current system of IPTR is no longer acceptable. Clinician after clinician came before the Health Committee of this Parliament and criticised the system. They were very brave to do so, but they were being placed in the invidious position of recommending patients that they knew would benefit from the drug required, knowing that their chances of securing agreement from the Health Board was indeed very slim. And let me point you to the words of Dr Stephen Harrow, consultant oncologist at the Beatson. He told the committee, "I'm working in quite a deprived area of the west of Scotland, and I'm basically telling patients that there are more drugs that are not available than drugs that they can access." And it took the shocking case of Ian Morrison, highlighted in this chamber, to prompt action. Here was a man with bowel cancer that had to pay £1,700 a fortnight for the drugs that will help prolong his life. And the NHS charged him VAT and an admin fee for the privilege. Thankfully, he has now got access to the drug, but I understand it took more than one request and the assistance of his constituency MSP. Then we heard the case of Anne Fisher, a mother of 3 from Greenock who has cancer. She can't get access to drugs here that are available if she lived in England. And that just can't be right by any measure. And then there is the case of my own constituent. I'll call her Mrs Smith, but that isn't her real name. Mrs Smith was diagnosed with bowel cancer in 2007. Her daughter and her husband contacted my office in 2012, after she had had 2 IPTR requests and appeals rejected. As a result of tests carried out by experts, we know she would benefit from a 12-week course of cetuximab. Her 3rd IPTR request, last October, was also unsuccessful. Yet in another health board, she would have been given the treatment. This just cannot go on, Cabinet Secretary. And whatever the outcome of the review, the Cabinet Secretary must ensure that at the very least there isn't this appalling postcode lottery in Scotland. Access to medicines must improve. There must be consistency of application across all 14 health boards in Scotland. 14 different ways of doing things, frankly, is no longer acceptable. Presiding Officer, let me turn to the Orphan Drugs Fund. Whilst this is indeed very welcome, it mustn't just be a sticking plaster. There is a need for clarity on how this will be accessed, what conditions will apply, how it will be funded beyond April next year, and indeed concerns have been raised by many, including the Daily Record, who reported that if every eligible cystic fibrosis sufferer in Scotland was to be prescribed Calideco, it would cost £14.5 million. Calideco is just one of a number of orphan medicines, so we need to be clear about how access will be decided. And, Presiding Officer, in closing, I was reflecting on the last rather robust, sometimes humorous debate about capital budgets. But, it made me think the Cabinet Secretary has no obstacle to doing something. This isn't Westminster's fault. This is something that is all our responsibility. And I know the Cabinet Secretary, unlike his predecessor, has moved quickly to set up the review. As people across Scotland are waiting for life-saving treatments, can he move equally quickly to set up new arrangements that will work in their interests? Thank you.
Thank you very much. This debate is extremely tight. We've already lost a member from it. I have to ask members to take only their 4 minutes. I call Aileen MacLeod to be followed by Duncan McNeill. First of all, can I ask Jackie Bailey to move an amendment?
I move.
Thank you. Aileen MacLeod to be followed by Duncan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. and I welcome the opportunity to debate this very serious and sensitive issue, particularly as a member of the Health and Sport Committee, since it forms part of our current work plan. And I'd like to start by welcoming the Scottish Government's £21 million Rare Condition Medicines Fund, which is a response to the interim recommendations from Professor Charles Swinson, who is leading the review of the individual patient treatment request system. And I hope that the Swinson review, along with the work that Professors Philip Routledge and Bill Scott are doing on the new medicines approval process of the SMC and the implementation of SMC advice by health boards, will help to improve the access to medicines in Scotland and ensure the system is as flexible and responsive as it can and should be. Of course, this review is ongoing, and we still await its final report to the Government in the spring. Now, I note the Cabinet Secretary's undertaking to take forward the recommendations, so the Government is listening and has listened to the concerns raised by some of our clinicians and patients on access to new medicines. And as the Conservative Party motion also refers to the need to promote Scotland as a centre of medical innovation and research, I want to reflect on the efforts the Scottish Government is making in this area. If we consider, for example, the Government's Statement of Intent for Innovation in Health launched last June, it is clear the Government is promoting innovation and excellence through the NHS, including new medicines, and that this is very much linked to biosciences, with the employment and sustainable growth we all hope the sector will continue to generate. Projects such as the Edinburgh Bioquarter or the partnership between Biocities Scotland and Newhouse in Lanarkshire and Dundee University, which has attracted the biggest ever investment of its kind in Scotland, £100 million of European investment for a drug discovery project, suggests to me that Scotland's life sciences sector, supported as it is by our world-class universities and research capability, has every opportunity to grow and flourish. Presiding Officer, I also want to touch on the issue of the Cancer Drugs Fund, and I recognise, of course, that this is a very sensitive matter and one that confronts policymakers and the medical profession in all publicly funded health systems. The real difficulty in accepting the principle of a special fund for cancer drugs is that we, as policymakers, are implicitly asserting that cancer is somehow more significant than other serious long-term or life-threatening conditions. And I don't believe that is our task, and I don't believe by so doing that we could be serving the wider interests of all those who rely on our National Health Service.
Jackson Carlo.
I understand the point the member is making, but she has just referred to the £21 million that's been made available for the Rare Conditions Medicine Fund. Has that not, in fact, established the principle of committing funding to rare conditions which now exclude cancer?
Aileen McLeod, and you're approaching your last minute.
Can I just say to the member, presiding officer, that I speak as somebody who has worn both hats, both as a policymaker and as a cancer victim and a cancer survivor. So I'm very acutely aware of how cancer sufferers and their families feel. But actually what I want to be doing is actually preventing people from getting to that stage where they need cancer drugs, and that's why the Scottish Government's £30 million Detect Cancer Early programme is so important. In conclusion, presiding officer, the Scottish Government is taking the issue of access to new medicines extremely seriously. It is reviewing the processes involved in a detailed and comprehensive manner, and ministers have already indicated and demonstrated their willingness to act on interim recommendations and allocate significant funding. All of us in this chamber are extremely concerned that people with the clinical need to access new medicines can and should do so, and the Scottish Government is no less committed to that aim, and it will do so while protecting the fundamental principles of universal provision that undermine our NHS. And I support the Government's amendment this afternoon.
Thank you. I call Duncan McNeill to be followed by Bob Doris.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And we'll hear, I'm sure, a lot about National Institute of Clinical Evidence here today, Scottish Medical Consortium, individual patient treatment requests, quality costs, modifiers, area drug and therapeutic committees, value-based pricing, new duties, etc., etc. And if anybody is confused after that list, then you know why we need a review into a very complex set of arrangements that is supposedly designed to ensure that people get access to the medicines that they require when they face very serious circumstances. So I'm very proud, although I'll not say too much about the committee's point of view because we haven't come to a view. So I'll be very careful of that, but I'm very proud that we have been able to the Health and Sport Committee, have been able to help push this along. And push this along, I would argue, was required, because we were here in this chamber on the 29th of September 2011. And the Cabinet Secretary said that further consideration to the role in therapeutic committees would be carried out. We would need to look at that. Individual treatment requests would need to be looked at to inform the government's point of view. And indeed, in correspondence with the Cabinet Secretary at that time, I was told that in January 12, that the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Pharmaceutical Officer had convened a clinical group to look at the focus of ensuring a timious consideration of SMC processes, and indeed was going to look at the individual patient treatment requests. So it's taken us a wee while, but it would be remiss not to recognise the important role that those people who were campaigning for not just themselves to get access to medicines, who were seriously denigrated in an article recently in the Daily Record, one of them my constituents. They have brought this Parliament and doing a job. They have campaigned not just for themselves, but against an unjust system that they found it difficult to understand, that denied them medicines that were life-changing and could, yes, of course, will take your intervention.
John McAlpine.
I think he was referring to my article in the Daily Record, and I thank him for taking the intervention which Mr Carlaw didn't have the guts to take. The article in the Record was well balanced and looked at the sensitivity of the issues, but perhaps the drug that his constituent was affected by was one that NICE in England only gave consent for after the pharmaceutical company gave a discount for the drug that's not available in Scotland. And doesn't he agree with me that there is an issue here with pharmaceutical companies holding the health service ransom?
I hope I'm given additional time.
I'm afraid this debate is very short.
Your premise in that article was that politicians shouldn't be involved in this process at all. If we set the parameters, we provide the money, we have a legitimate role in this process, a very legitimate role in this process, which I've just described. We have debated this. We have had delay. We have dragged our feet in dealing with a process that is now recognised as failing people.
Mr McNeill, you must conclude.
That's why the Cabinet Secretary has instigated a review of that process. It does matter, though, that time. That we lost precious time, but not as precious as Anne Fisher, who currently is being judged for her access to that medicine on procedures that this Parliament are reviewing as not fit for purpose. It's time we reviewed and looked again at Anne Fisher's case.
I must advise members that we may lose another member from this debate. I call Bob Doris to be followed by Nanette Millen, and members must take interventions in their own time.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I do welcome this debate, even if I'm not able to accept the Conservative motion before us this afternoon. I'd like to outline why to Jackson Carlaw that I'm doing that. I believe, Mr Carlaw will not share that view, but I believe that Conservatives are creating the perception that drugs not routinely approved by the SMC should pretty much always be approved routinely by another method. He also name-checks cancer specifically. Well, all drugs are not routinely approved by method A, method B, method C, by whatever method. That has never happened in Scotland, and it's never happened anywhere in the UK. It's never been the case. So if I could say gently to Mr Carlaw, I believe that creates a false perception that all new drugs will be made available one way or another, and that's not the case. That's also the false perception with individual patient treatment requests, in my view, where any patient who is not routinely prescribed a drug can be encouraged to fill out an IPTR, even if there is little hope of that drug necessarily being approved. I hear Mr Simpson speaking from a sedentary position. I would just point out to Mr Simpson that there is a patchwork approach across the country to which local authorities, which health board areas are actually putting forward IPTRs. There is a lack of consistency there, and there has to be a reason for that. I think to single out cancer for special treatment is a dangerous precedent as well, and that's actually why the outgoing chair of Nice said that there are rotten diseases apart from cancer, and to limit it to cancer has always made me a bit uncomfortable, to be honest, and that was Sir Michael Rawlings. Indeed, the incoming chair of Nice, Professor Haslam, also said there are other conditions that are as serious as cancer, and we should not discriminate against those because they do not have as frightening a name. So we have to be very careful. Yes, we have to treat cancer incredibly seriously, but we also have to make sure that other conditions are not seen as second-class, serious and life-threatening conditions. We have to approach it in an equitable point of view, and that is a difficult job for the SMC to do, but is one they should do rather than politicians. Politicians should get the process right and then ask the SMC to make their judgment based on that process, and not just the outgoing chair of NICE and the current chair of NICE, but also Prostate Cancer UK, Breakthrough Breast Cancer, Melanoma UK, Macmillan Cancer Support and others all reject the idea of special treatment, appropriate treatment for cancer, but not special treatment for cancer in terms of our Cancer Drugs Fund. So, as difficult a decision as it is for the SMC, they do have to make it. And when they make it, they can't just consider cancer, they have to consider heart disease, MS, cystic fibrosis, and the list goes on and on and on. It's an unenviable task to compare these conditions and work out what gives has the best evidence base to have the best impact for patients and to be cost-effectiveness. That is a huge challenge for SMC, and they're actually world leaders at doing that process, and the review, I'm sure, will improve that process as it currently stands. I also want to talk a little bit about funding, because funding can't be spoken about in a vacuum in terms of cancer drugs. I know the Health Secretary, Alec Neil, launched the Bowel Cancer Detection Hotline just the other day. Detect Cancer Early initiatives cost money, and I'll give the number 0800 0121 833, and I would encourage all men over 50 to call that hotline and get themselves screened. No, Jackie Bailey, I'm not over 50, but I am almost there. But it does draw the attention, all this costs money. If Mr Carlow wants to spend money in one place, he has to take it away from another place, and we have to get the balance right. I believe we do have the balance right, but the process can be improved. I wish we could talk more about issues with IPTRs and rare conditions, because it has been identified that rare conditions are not suitably dealt with under IPTRs.
I'm afraid you must finish
and the review
now.
will deal with that. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. I call Nanette Millen to be followed by Jane Baxter with less than 4 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, I was a member of the Public Petitions Committee in 2008 when Mike Gray from my region presented a petition to Parliament while suffering from terminal bowel cancer, which was being treated by the non-formulary drug cetuximab. He had initially paid for this drug himself, after his consultant's request for it under the exceptional prescribing procedure had been turned down by NHS Grampian. Mr Gray had found the procedure obscure and difficult to navigate, and in his state of health this was extremely stressful and upsetting. He brought the petition to Parliament to try and ensure that a better process would be put in place for future patients so that they wouldn't have to undergo the traumas of his own experience. In the end, Mr Gray was allowed his cetuximab under the NHS, and indeed was reimbursed for the significant costs he had previously faced up to personally. Sadly, he didn't live to see the results of his petition, but his wife Tina McGeever worked tirelessly alongside the committee to secure the new IPTR procedure put in place by the then Health Secretary to make it easier for patients to access modern non-formulary cancer drugs, recommended by their clinicians as likely to extend and to benefit their quality of life. And everyone was hopeful that future cancer patients would experience a simplified, transparent procedure across Scotland to allow fair access to modern cancer medicines when their clinicians felt they were justified. However, despite 3 CMO guidance documents issued to health boards in as many years, there is as yet no significant evidence to suggest an improvement in access or even a significantly reduced level of inequality between health boards regarding the implementation of the IPTR process. And I know that Tina McGeever and many of us here were very concerned to learn that Christine Graham's constituent Ian Morrison is currently having a very similar experience to Mike Gray and is having to fund cetuximab treatment himself. So the review of the IPTR process set up by the Cabinet Secretary is very welcome. In the meantime, a fund such as the Cancer Drugs Fund, established in England but refused in Scotland on the grounds that it would be discriminatory against non-cancer patients, could have helped nearly 2,500 Scottish patients so far. And of course, whilst we welcome the Rare Conditions Medicines Fund, this will clearly not benefit patients like Ian Morrison, and it's awful to think that patients unfortunate enough to develop their cancer in Scotland are not getting some of the new drugs which are now available in England and elsewhere. Moreover, as pointed out by oncologists giving evidence recently to the Health and Sport Committee, because patients here do not have access to these medicines, they will not get the next generation state-of-the-art drugs when these undergo clinical trial, because the new drugs will be judged against those which are currently not approved or available in Scotland, but regarded as standard therapies elsewhere in the UK. Already this is leading to some difficulty in recruiting expert staff in our hospitals, and it could result in a drift of experience from Scotland.
1 minute left.
If that happens, we could soon lose our position as a leader in cutting-edge medical research. No one disagrees that new drugs require assessment, or that the SNC does this with a high degree of expertise and professionalism. But current assessment methods have been shown to disadvantage some disease areas, and hopefully the current review will result in further evolution of currently used methods to allow a wider assessment of a medicine's value. Presiding Officer, the Cancer Drugs Fund in England and the proposed Rare Conditions Medicines Fund in Scotland are intended to bridge the gap until value-based pricing is introduced next year. But we must remember that the new pricing mechanism will apply only to drugs which come on stream after its introduction, and cancer patients who need currently available non-formulary drugs will still lose out unless some form of funding is put in place for them to gain access to these medicines. So to conclude, Presiding Officer, I fully endorse the motion in Jackson Carlow's name and the Labour amendment.
Thank you. I'm sorry, in taking the next two backbench speakers, I can only give them 3.5 minutes each. Jane Baxter, to be followed by Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I will begin by declaring an interest as a survivor of cancer who takes cancer medication every day. It was a life-changing event for me to get a cancer diagnosis and to experience the fear and loneliness that went with it, and the total dependence on our wonderful National Health Service. But I was lucky. Early detection, prompt and skillful treatment and aftercare from the Maggie's Centre gave me the ability to get on with my life and to be here today. I count myself very lucky, but I now take nothing for granted. Having had that experience, I cannot begin to imagine how it must feel to be told that you have cancer, but that you won't get help because of anomalies in the system, whether that's down to money or because of where you live. I know that choices have to be made, but we could at least allow cancer patients to retain their self-respect and not be reduced to lobbying and campaigning for the same chance which was freely offered to me. What is clear from the debate so far is that we must have a robust, fair and transparent system for access to medicines in our health system. The evidence to the Health and Sport Committee's ongoing inquiry has provided a crucial insight into the issues faced not just by patients and their representative organisations, but the healthcare professionals trying to work within the bounds of a complex system. I thank the committee for their ongoing work on this matter. In the debate about access to medicines not routinely available, the individual patient treatment request system is thrown up time and again. It seems that the number of ITP requests made each year are relatively low, and anecdotally that the level of both submissions of and patient participation in the IPTR system varies across health boards in Scotland. This may, of course, be down to a variety of factors, including the cumbersome nature of the process and time required for each application. But what it certainly does do is feed into an uncertainty which exists about the fairness of the system, with patients left feeling they're in a random postcode lottery. In many cases, the reason why you're not being offered a certain medicine or treatment is complex, but for those patients who have been diagnosed with a rare or complicated illness, it is often the end of a long, difficult process, and by the time of diagnosis, many will wish to just begin treatment. To then discover that a series of barriers lie in your way, whether real or perceived, to a drug which could assist you is potentially devastating news. And whilst there is an appeal process, whether the patient or the patient's consultant would want to go through such a process is another matter. When we recognise the need for effective community engagement and delivery of local health services, we must also recognise the need for effective engagement with patients at a higher decision-making level in areas such as access to new medicines. Among the campaigners and health professionals giving evidence to the Health and Sport Committee recently, there appeared to be a certain level of confusion about different health boards' interpretation of the current system in place for accessing medicines. This is despite good practice guidance being published by the Scottish Government and the Chief Medical Officer in Scotland on the framework and consideration of IPTRs.
30 seconds left.
Therefore, Presiding Officer, if we, as a motion from the Conservatives suggests, move to introduce new funding, then it must be in a way which does not exacerbate the current postcode lottery and puts fairness of access for patients at its heart.
Many thanks. I call Mark MacDonald, 3.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. This is an emotive subject, and on an emotive subject it is always really important that we ensure that the words that we use are carefully chosen. And can I just say that I think that it is using the term life-saving, when with many of these medications we are talking about life-extending rather than life-saving, I think we have to be very careful when we use those kinds of terms in this chamber. Indeed, I would refer to the author Dr Ben Goldacre, who writes the Bad Science column for The Guardian and has also written a book, Bad Pharma. And within that book he says sometimes a deceptively simple explanation for a complex phenomenon can be very powerful. It can prime the reader to accept a specific treatment, but it can also change our whole cultural understanding of a disease. To illustrate that point, he looks at Herceptin and looks at the media coverage around Herceptin. Much of the media coverage around Herceptin actually took place before the drug had even been submitted to NICE for approval, and any of the clinical data was available in the public domain. Yet there was already a concerted media campaign to allow for Herceptin to be put through by NICE. That, I think, illustrates the point that he was trying to make. And that is the point that I want to focus some of my speech on, is around, while we're here talking about medicines and talking about availability of medicines, there is a start point here which we need to focus on as well, and that's the issue of trials and clinical data. Currently, the current best estimate, from a briefing that I've received, current best estimate is that half of all the clinical trials that have been conducted and completed have never been published in academic journals, and trials with positive results are twice as likely to be published as others. This figure comes from a systematic review conducted in 2010. Now, if we are going to have a serious discussion around the availability of medicines, we have to ensure that we are doing so based on all of the available data that relates to the medicines that we are discussing. Otherwise, we are failing patients and failing the public. We are further within that briefing, it states, we are not aware of any UK legislation requiring the results of all trials on all drugs in current use to be made available. There is legislation requiring disclosure of adverse events and other monitoring of clinical trials within the UK, and regulation for good clinical practice in the conduct of trials by the MHRA. This legislation does not address biased under-reporting of clinical trials and should not be confused with the issue of missing results. Therefore, today, Presiding Officer, I signed up to the All Trials campaign, which is calling for all clinical trials to be published, regardless of the result that comes from them. It's a huge number of individuals signed up to that, and I will quote just one because time is limited. The campaigner Lynn Faulds-Wood, who says, "Good information about drug performance and trials means life or death to many patients, but we are frequently not getting it. It is appalling that pharma companies can choose how much to tell us and hide results they don't like." And I hope that all members would back the All Trials campaign and ensure that when we come to this chamber and discuss availability of medicines, all of the information is available to us. Very, very briefly, on rare conditions. The reason it is disanalogous on rare conditions is because with rare conditions, the patient cohort is so tiny that the likelihood of affordability of medicines is virtually nil, and that was evidence that was borne out to the Health Committee. So that's why it is not analogous to take the Rare Conditions Fund and apply it to other conditions which have a much wider patient cohort. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. We turn to the winding up speeches, and I call on Dr Richard Simpson with a maximum 4 minutes.
Me now?
Yes, please.
Sorry, Presiding Officer, I've just used up some of my time. But this is access to medicines is a difficult area, and of course it's correct that politicians shouldn't be involved in the individual decisions. That would be a complete anathema. But it is wrong to say that we as politicians are not involved. We set, as Duncan McNeill said, we set the framework, we provide the money. And it's that framework and that funding that is at the centre of the debate today. So I have to say I thought June McAlpine's article was not helpful in this respect. Now, there is general support for the Scottish... No, I won't. I'm sorry, you had a long go at it before. Scottish Medicines Consortium. And that has not wavered except to look forward to the increased public participation. The fact that all medicines as submitted by industry are reviewed, and not just those referred by a politician, I think is an important differential statement made by Scotland rather than what happens in England. But the spending on medicines is lower in the UK than in the rest of Europe, and indeed the spending now on innovative medicines in Scotland, having been the highest of the 4 countries, is now the lowest. And this actually does have, I think, is of some importance, which I'll return to if I have time. Jackson Carlaw emphasised that the almost universal experience of cancer and the equally universal desire for cure, or if not cure, then relief or remedy, is something that means it is universal. But I have to say that cancer treatment has almost always been incremental. Mark MacDonald made the point about it not being life-saving, but I have to say to him that improvements are almost always incremental. When I was a junior doctor, children with leukemia were only surviving for a year or 2. They now survive with a normal life expectancy. But that didn't happen in one blinding flash. It happened because of a series of drugs that were added to, that were mixed and improved. And it occurred over time. I don't have time. I'm sorry, Mark. MacDonald, sorry. One of the concerns is that the oncologists are saying to us that they don't have standard international treatments, and that was given in evidence to the committee, to the Health and Sport Committee. Then I think we really have a problem, and we have to be sure that medicines are available by one or other system. Now, Jackson Carlaw reminded us about the place of Scotland in clinical research, and Aileen MacLeod referred to the bioquarter. It is important for our research base that we actually do ensure that innovative medicines that we're involved in the trials of are then generally available. Now, what about the IPTR? Because that is the area that is important. But before I come to that, I want to say one thing, and that is that the system that we have, where the SMC approves something for unrestricted use and 14 separate committees then decide on what happens, is wrong. Now, the Cell letter says it now must be done within 90 days. That was as a result of pressure in the last Parliament, that we insisted that 18-month delays were unacceptable. But I have to say to the Cabinet Secretary, the loopholes are still there. They're using the fact that there isn't a clinical pathway to often delay things much further. This system is dysfunctional. It must end. We must ensure that drugs that are approved for unrestricted use are actually then applied in a much more universal way. Now, IPTR in the last 30 seconds. The IPTR system is dysfunctional. I think that's generally recognised. While Doris said we need consistency, and Jane Baxter emphasised fairness. These are 2 important points. But there's a catch-22, that IPTR can only be applied to a patient who is different from the trial patients on whom the licence was applied. Now, that is very difficult, if not impossible, for orphan drugs.
Dr Simpson, you really need to close.
I'll close on the fact that we have a dysfunctional system. I welcome the review. I welcome the new £21 million, but we must have published lists of all those consulted, and the stakeholders must be consulted before the final decisions are reached.
Thank you very much. Cabinet Secretary, you should have 6 minutes. If you could take less, I'd be grateful. I've already cut Mr Carlaw's time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. Let me use the opportunity to clear up a number of points that have been raised during the debate. First of all, the point about consistency and making sure there is no postcode lottery in Scotland in terms of differentiation about the access to drugs between one area and another. I have made it absolutely clear from the day and hour I set up the Routledge inquiry. I see a key part of the aim of the Routledge inquiry is to make recommendations to ensure there is absolutely consistency of approach right across Scotland, and there is no postcode lottery in terms of access to drugs within Scotland. The second point I should just make is a factual one, and that is about the Rare Conditions Fund that we set up, the £22 million. I think it was Jackson Carlaw who said that anyone with cancer does not have access to that. That's actually not the case, because very clearly there are some cancers which are rare conditions, and in those circumstances, in principle, people would have access to that fund's resources. Thirdly, just for the record, I think it was Jackie Bailey who quoted the Daily Record in terms of the costs of the fund for cystic fibrosis. Let me make it clear that we've identified 51 children in Scotland with the Celtic gene who have cystic fibrosis who would benefit from the Kalydeco drug. The total cost of that is not £14.5 million, but £9 million. I should also point out that the £22 million fund is for 13 months only, not for a period of 2 or 3 years, and therefore, if every single penny of the £9 million was spent, there would still be a substantial amount of money left to deal with other situations as well. And I think it's useful, hopefully, for the Chamber to be aware of those facts. Fourthly, let me just make it clear, dealing with the final point made by Richard Simpson. The report by Professor Routledge should be with me by the end of the calendar month, by the end of February. I do not intend to make any final decisions on its recommendations until two things have happened. Number one, that I see the outcome of the committee's recommendations and take into account of what the committee has to say about this subject. But secondly, I do want to consult on the recommendations made in the report, and I will consult the other parties in this chamber as well as the stakeholder groups. I think it's extremely important that we get the decision on these recommendations right, because if we rush into a decision and we don't make the right decision, then we'll be back here in a year's time debating this subject over again. If there are any urgent measures required that are recommended in the report, clearly, in those circumstances, I would implement the urgent measures, but again, I would still do a quick consultation with the appropriate stakeholders and indeed with the other parties in this chamber. I think it's very important if we can speak with one voice in the chamber. Can I just stress two other points that I want to make? And this is where I think we have the difficulty with a specific fund for a specific condition like cancer. The first point is this. Why would we only have a fund to deal with cancer and not with other terminal conditions such as motor neuron disease, MS or muscular dystrophy? I don't think that we can play God and decide if you've got terminal cancer, you should be favoured over somebody with terminal muscular dystrophy, MS or motor neuron disease. And therefore, that is one reason genuinely why I'm concerned about repeating the example down south. Secondly, can I also say that new medicines are not always, or medicines are not always the only or the most effective way to deal with cancer in the modern world. Cancer treatment comprises of much more than medicines. And to give you an example, over the last 3 years, the Scottish Cancer Task Force has made over £3 million available to develop the introduction of new technologies and drive forward improvement to meet the ambitions of the quality strategy. And NHS Scotland is in a strong position and able to provide patients with other new treatments, such as intensity-modulated radiation therapy. Access to these therapies is as important as access to the medicines. So this is not just about drugs, it's also about other treatments as well. And the final point I would make in relation to the Cancer Fund Drugs Fund down south, I would point out, first of all, the most recent Cancer Drugs Fund Bulletin, August 2012, shows that there are inconsistencies of approach for funding many medicines through the fund in England, and many patients actually receive refusals. So in that situation, it's very, very similar to the situation we are discussing today in relation to the IPTRs. And the final point I would make is that a study by the Bangor University published last year from the Centre for Health Economics and Medicines Evaluation suggests that the principle of the Cancer Drugs Fund is not supported by the public, and that was a survey across the United Kingdom. The report also found that more than 65% of people did not support paying more for cancer medicines over other medicines for equally serious health problems.
Cabinet Secretary, you must
that's
finish.
A sentiment I share, and that's genuinely nothing to do with party politics. That's genuinely why we have resisted a cancer drugs fund in Scotland.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Jackson Carlaw. To wind up the debate, Mr Carlaw, I'm afraid I've already advised you I can only give you 7 minutes.
I thought it was 6. I'm quite happy to have given up time to facilitate other colleagues making contributions. Can I just begin, I think, with a correction? I attributed Sandra White's motion to breast cancer when it is in fact bowel cancer, but I would still encourage all members in the chamber to support that motion. I'd also like to thank everybody for the way in which they have contributed to the debate this afternoon. I feel this has moved the discussion in the chamber on the subject of access to cancer medicines on from where we were when we last discussed this on a Conservative motion some 18 months ago. And I thank the Cabinet Secretary, in fact, for some of the points that he made in his summation this afternoon, because he has, I think, given some clarity on the Rare Conditions Medicines Fund in terms of what he expects the individual costs to be in relation to the particular drug that has been featured. And I accept the point he makes that, of course, there are orphan cancers which will potentially benefit from that fund too. I also earlier, I think, paid tribute to the fact that he has moved to establish the various inquiries that he has, which I think will be instrumental in potentially bringing about the kind of change many on all sides of the chamber. And I think Jim Eadie on the SNP side was one of those who hoped to see that progress being made in consequence. And of course I mentioned too the health and sport inquiry that Duncan McNeill referred to. And in his contribution, of course, and in others, he made mention of Joan McAlpine. And I do apologise, I wasn't aware that she was in the chamber earlier. I've never been accused of lacking guts in the chamber before, and I'm very happy to facilitate an intervention from Ms McAlpine if she'd like to make one now.
Joan McAlpine.
Thank the member very much for taking the intervention. I wouldn't expect him to agree with anything I write in the Daily Record, but perhaps he would like to reflect on comments by Alan Maynard, the Professor of Health Economics in York, who's the leading authority on health economics in the UK. He described the Cancer Drugs Fund as allowing the pharmaceutical industry to charge very high prices for drugs whose effectiveness hadn't been proven, and he described it as pork barrel politics to bring home the bacon to your supporters in the pharmaceutical industry.
I saw that comment from Professor Maynard. In fact, we looked into it in a little detail. It was made actually several months before the institution of the Cancer Drugs Fund in England in 2010. And on inquiry, we got a slightly more equivocal response in respect of the way things are today. But I would say to Ms McAlpine, I understand what she said in her article, and I'm not going to use the language of lacking guts. But, you know, I would have preferred if she was going to comment on ipilimumab and its effectiveness and the fact that it only gives a few additional months of life, if she'd managed to come along to that dinner and argue her case in front of the organisation supporting that drug and the patients who had benefited from it. That is actually where I think part of her case should be made, not just somewhere else in a national newspaper. I actually think that most of the contributions this afternoon were very pertinent and to the point, and I won't single any of them out, but Nanette Milne, Jane Baxter, Mark MacDonald, Richard Simpson, and I would say to Bob Doris and to the Cabinet Secretary, our motion today makes no specific mention of a cancer drugs fund, and in fact, if you look at it, it talks about cancer sufferers and others of other conditions too. We accept value pricing is going to make the difference in a reasonably short space of time, but we believe that until that point, there is, as a result of the SMC process, an inequality of access to cancer medicines which are available today, for which everyone in this chamber has all their life hoped to see being made available to alleviate certain cancers. And I would hope that the government would be able, in the light of the reviews that are in place ahead of value pricing, to be able to make those access to those drugs for cancer and for other conditions available by exception. And the Cabinet Secretary asked me, how would you fund that? And let me say, well, Audit Scotland identified in their recent report £26 million worth of waste. 2 councils alone with a blue bag scheme managed to amass 2 tonnes of prescription drugs that had not been used. Audit Scotland also tells us that in the 3 years 2012 to 2015, medicines coming off patent or becoming generic will release £316 million of budget on the drugs budget in Scotland, £26 million being released in the current year itself, from a drugs budget of £1.5 billion. I believe that the funding does exist, in the same way that the funding was made available from within those resources for the £21 million that is being made available for the Rare Conditions Medicine Fund. Where a new standard of care for cancer or whatever has been established outside of current Scottish practice, A new mechanism should be introduced that would enable a consensus application for funding to be made by Scottish physicians who can provide expert opinion within their clinical field. The Scottish Government could then enter commercial negotiations with the manufacturer to ensure the best value for Scotland based on the true value medicines bring to patients. This would ensure that Scottish patients could attain the same standard of care fairly and equitably across the country and would not miss out on the opportunity of benefit from innovative treatments. Mr MacDonald.
Mark MacDonald.
Would the member accept my point that I made in my speech, though, that we cannot legitimately talk about benefit to patients without all of the available trial data relating to medicines, and that's why it's so crucial that all trial data for all medicines is made publicly available?
I think Mr MacDonald made his point well, and I support that. But we are talking here now about drugs which are available, where Scotland, in many respects, as I said earlier, is one of the countries in Europe which is affording less access than most other nations, where we spend per head less on drugs, and particularly on cancer drugs, on cure for the population. So there is progress that can be made, and I think the Government are ready to make that move. I sense in the conduct of the debate today and in what has been said in the Health and Sport Committee and elsewhere that progress can be made. On behalf of cancer patients across Scotland, Scottish Conservatives believe that we have stood behind them. We believe that others in the Chamber are ready to make that commitment too, and I hope that these reviews and the leadership of the Cabinet Secretary will mean that when we next debate this, we are debating progress, material progress, in the treatment of cancer in Scotland.
That concludes the debate on health. We now move to the next item of business, which is consideration of a business motion 5679 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme. Any member who wishes to speak against the motion, please press the request to speak button now. And I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 5679.
Formally moved.
No member has asked to speak against the motion, therefore I will now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 5679 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of business motion 5667 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a Stage 2 timetable for the High Hedges Scotland Bill. I would ask any member who wishes to speak against the motion to press the request to speak button now. And I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 5667.
Formally moved.
No member has asked to speak against the motion, therefore I now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 5667 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of a Parliamentary Bureau motion. I would ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 5666 on designation of a lead committee. The question on this motion will be put at decision time. There are 7 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is amendment number 5653.2 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon, which seeks to amend motion number 5653 in the name of Gavin Brown on capital projects be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 5653.2 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon is as follows. Yes, 61. No, 54. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed to. The next question is amendment number 5653 in the name of Richard Baker, which seeks to amend motion number 5653 in the name of Gavin Brown on capital projects be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. Therefore, we move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 5653.1 in the name of Richard Baker is as follows. Yes, 52. No, 63. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question is that motion number 5653 in the name of Gavin Brown as amended on capital projects be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. Therefore, we move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion number 5653 in the name of Gavin Brown as amended is as follows. Yes, 62. No, 53. There were no abstentions. The motion as amended is therefore agreed to. The next question is that amendment number 5654.2 in the name of Alex Neil, which seeks to amend motion number 5654 in the name of Jackson Carlaw on health be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 5654.2 in the name of Alex Neil is as follows. Yes, 67. No, 2. There were 46 abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed to. The next question is amendment number 5654.1 in the name of Jackie Bailey, which seeks to amend motion number 5654 in the name of Jackson Carlaw on health be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 5654.1 in the name of Jackie Bailey is as follows. Yes, 54. No, 61. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question is that motion number 5654 in the name of Jackson Carlaw as amended be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Are we all agreed? Parliament is agreed, therefore the motion is agreed to. The next question is that motion number 5666 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on designation of a lead committee be agreed to. Are we all agreed? That motion is also agreed to. That concludes decision time. We now move to members' business. Members who leave the chamber should do so quickly and quietly.